The first-class ticket slipped from her hand like a quiet act of defiance. Evelyn Carter looked at it, the seat number 2. A printed clearly, and suddenly realized that for 68 years she had always sat in the back row of every train in her life. Today that had to change. Dawn was breaking over Atlanta, sunlight spilling across the edge of the international terminal. Streams of passengers flowed through the airport like a restless river, everyone busy, everyone rushing. But Evelyn, with her neatly pinned silver hair and small yet steady frame, walked slowly through the crowd, a graceful, quiet note in a loud symphony. On her shoulder hung a worn brown leather bag, a relic from her decades as a schoolteacher in South Atlanta, where the sound of the dismissal bell had once been the rhythm of her heart for more than 30 years. Today she was no longer Miss Carter to the children. She was simply Evelyn, the woman who had lost her husband when her youngest was just 10, the mother who had raised 3 children on a modest salary, the woman who once promised herself, "One day, I'll sit where I choose, not where I'm told." Naomi, her eldest granddaughter, would graduate tomorrow as an environmental engineer from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. That young woman was the pride of the entire family, the result of countless nights. Evelyn stayed up grading papers and years of saving every penny to keep her children in school. And this time, she wasn't just attending the ceremony, she wanted to be present. Because all her life, Evelyn had taught her students, don't be afraid to take up space. You have the right to exist. Now it was time she lived by that lesson herself. On the airport screen, the words Blue Sky Airlines, Flight 317 to Boston, blinked softly. Evelyn adjusted her ivory cardigan, the pearl earrings catching the morning light. She looked around and smiled at the check-in clerk, the smile of someone who had learned to be kind, even when the world wasn't always kind back. The young attendant scanned her ticket, looked up and smiled. "Have a wonderful flight, Mrs. Carter?" The sound made her nod gently. Mrs. Carter. 2 small words that carried a lifetime of effort to be remembered with respect. When she stepped into the first-class cabin, everything seemed brighter. Soft lights, deep brown leather seats, the faint aroma of coffee in the air. She found seat 2A by the window. Carefully she set down her bag, smoothed her blouse, and sat upright. In that moment her heartbeat slowed, steady calm filled with pride. A flight attendant smiled politely. "First time flying first class, ma'am. Do I look that easy to guess?" Evelyn chuckled, a spark of mischief in her eyes. "Not at all, you look wonderful," the young woman replied, walking away with a warmth that lingered in the air. Evelyn turned to the window. Golden sunlight traced the length of the plane's wing. Memories began to flow, like a film playing backward. Children laughing in the classroom, her daughter shouting, "Mum!" I got into college, the rumble of the bus on cold winter mornings. They blended into a quiet melody that stopped here in this present moment, where she sat in seat 2A, a seat she had never dared to imagine for herself. She wasn't flying for luxury. She was flying to be seen. Beside her, a middle-aged white man adjusted his tie and opened a laptop. A young woman in a black suit read the business section of a newspaper. They all looked busy, perfectly at home in this space. Evelyn, with her thin but steady hands folded gently in her lap, simply thought, "I may not be rich, but I have lived fully." A simple thought, yet one built upon decades of endurance, effort, and sacrifice. A faint breeze slipped through the cabin as the crew sealed the doors. Evelyn closed her eyes. "This time I will not shrink," she told herself. Inside her heart, a quiet fear still lingered, Fear of being dismissed, of being doubted, of those familiar looks that questioned her place. But there was also something new, a power that was neither loud nor in need of approval. It was the power of choosing to sit in the seat she had chosen for herself. Behind her, someone laughed loudly and dropped a can of soda. A flight attendant apologized quickly. An announcement played over the speakers. The small chaos of life went on, but inside Evelyn's mind, there was only stillness. She pictured tomorrow, Naomi in her blue graduation gown, lifting her diploma high, her eyes bright with hope. Evelyn would sit in the front row, cheering just as she had cheered for her students years ago in that old school gym. She smiled a slow, deep smile carrying pride and peace. No one on that plane knew that the silver-haired woman in seat 2A had once been the first teacher to introduce a STEM program for black students in Atlanta's public schools. No one knew she had fought to keep a child from being expelled for being poor. No one knew she had once been called the quiet storm by her students. And now that quiet storm sat in seat 2A, calm but ready. Before the plane began to taxi, Evelyn glanced out the small window. The sun had fully risen, and the light filled her eyes glimmering, not just with reflection, but with belief. At 68, she finally understood. No one gives you the right to belong. You must claim it for yourself. She placed her hand on the ticket, resting on her lap, and whispered softly, "It's time we learn to hold our own place in this life." A soft chime rang out, signaling the plane's departure. Evelyn sat tall and took a deep breath. Everything within her, the fear, the pride, the memories blended into that single timeless moment. She had no idea that within just a few hours the world would come to know the name Evelyn Carter. And it all began with seat 2A. No one knew that just 15 minutes after the plane took off, a small moment would ripple into a wave that shook all of America. But for now, everything was still the fragile calm before a storm that had yet to be named. The first-class cabin was filled with morning light. The steady hum of the engines blended with the soft rustle of magazines, the clicking of laptop keys, and the gentle roll of the service cart along the aisle. Evelyn Carter sat quietly in seat 2, her hand smoothing the fabric of her sweater as her gaze drifted out the window. Below her, Atlanta grew smaller, the green patches shrinking into silver squares like a chessboard gleaming under the dawn. The brunette flight attendant from earlier returned her polite smile, now warmer, more natural. "Coffee or orange juice, ma'am?" "Coffee, thank you. Black, no sugar." Her voice was gentle, yet firm, the sound of someone who had learned to keep order in a noisy classroom with nothing but a look. When the cup was placed on her tray, Evelyn gave a small nod of thanks. She inhaled softly, the scent of coffee, rising, evoking memories of early mornings spent grading papers under the glow of an old desk lamp, mornings when she thought she would never have the luxury of simply resting. Beside her, a man in a dark blue suit, somewhere in his 40s, spoke quietly into his phone. His words were filled with talk of market share, dividends, and contracts. His tone arrogant, one polished shoe resting carelessly against the seat in front of him. Evelyn glanced at him briefly, not in judgment, but in quiet recognition. She had met hundreds of people like him in her lifetime, people who were used to sitting at the front, used to being served, and used to believing they were born deserving of it. Across the aisle, a young woman with short, curly hair, wearing a denim jacket and brown boots, flipped through a travel magazine. Occasionally her eyes lifted, scanning the cabin. She carried a quiet confidence, sharp, steady, unshakable. Evelyn smiled faintly. The woman reminded her of Naomi in her college days, curious, bold, and unwilling to accept injustice. The cabin door closed and the seatbelt sign lit up. A calm male voice came through the speakers. "Good morning, passengers. Blue Sky Flight 317 to Boston will be departing in a few minutes. The flight time today is approximately 2 hours and 13 minutes. Evelyn placed her hand on her knee, her thumb brushing against the old wedding ring she had worn for 32 years since her husband passed. The ring had lost its shine, but to her it was still a small light that had guided her through years of solitude. She closed her eyes. The engines grew louder, the plane vibrating gently. The feeling was familiar, but this time it was different. This time she wasn't squeezed between two strangers in row 28. She was at the front, with space to breathe, room to reflect. She thought of Naomi. That girl Evelyn smiled to herself. She's the reason her grandma is flying first class. When Naomi called to say she had been accepted to MIT, Evelyn cried, not out of pride, but because she remembered her former students who had been crushed under prejudice. She had taught children who had to fight just to sit at the front of a classroom. She knew too well that position was always about the right to be seen. A faint sound broke her thoughts, the soft click of the overhead compartment. A young blonde flight attendant walked past her face, composed, polite, but serious. Evelyn barely noticed. She was looking at a photo on her phone, Naomi in her graduation gown, eyes bright, holding up a model of a wind turbine. Grandma, I did it. Evelyn's heart warmed. In the row behind her, Rachel, the woman in the denim jacket, watched Evelyn through the gap between the seats. There was something about her posture, the steady hands, the calm gaze. Rachel couldn't explain it, but she felt that the woman carried a quiet authority, a kind of dignity, that made even silence feel powerful. She tucked her magazine away and scrolled through her phone. A headline appeared. Another airline discrimination case sparks outrage. Rachel sighed. I hope today doesn't become another one of those stories, she thought. The wheels of the plane lifted off the runway. The feeling of ascent, the soft drift, then the smooth glide forward. Blue Sky Flight 317 had officially left Atlanta. Evelyn felt her body leaned slightly, her hand tightening on the armrest, a reflex from years of driving the school bus on field trips. As the plane leveled at cruising altitude, she exhaled slowly. Everything was peaceful. A little girl in row 3 turned around and smiled at her. Evelyn smiled back, lifting her hand in a small wave. Their eyes met for a brief but tender moment. The child turned back to her mother, whispering something with a giggle. Evelyn couldn't hear it, but she understood. Sometimes a single smile was enough to soften the whole world. She took a sip of her coffee, the bitterness spreading across her tongue. She liked it that way, real, unfiltered, untouched. Just like her, she thought, not sweet, but true. The captain's voice came over the speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, please fasten your seatbelts. We may experience a little turbulence at 11,000 meters. Evelyn set down her cup and gripped the armrest. The plane trembled slightly, then steadied. The blonde flight attendant passed by, again her expression now tenser. Evelyn didn't know that it was that very look, the look of protocol and authority, that would soon become the spark of a story the entire nation would remember. But for now she was just a passenger, a 68-year-old black woman, sitting in seat 2. Savoring a quiet morning above the clouds. She didn't know that within minutes that calm would shatter, not because of turbulence in the air, but because of turbulence born of human prejudice. Evelyn turned her head toward the window. The clouds formed soft layers, sunlight spilling across them like golden silk. She thought to herself, "It's beautiful. I should take a photo for Naomi." She lifted her phone, the last photo of peace before the coming storm. Then, as if sensing it, Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. She couldn't tell if it was the air conditioning or the intuition of someone who had lived long enough to recognize when change was near. At the back of the cabin, the blonde attendant stopped glancing down at the passenger manifest. A flicker of confusion crossed her face. A small mix-up in the system. A late upgrade for a VIP traveler. Just a routine, administrative correction. But for Evelyn Carter, it would become a test of dignity of justice and of the power of quiet strength. In that moment, she had no idea. The world was about to see her, the small woman, in Seat 2A rides without ever leaving her seat. A soft chime echoed through the cabin. The overhead compartment door clicked shut. The service cart rolled slowly down the aisle. Everything seemed perfectly normal until a voice spoke beside Evelyn. "Excuse me, Ma'am. There seems to be a small issue with your seat." A simple sentence, yet within it was the faint slip of a world about to turn upside down. Evelyn looked up. In front of her stood a young flight attendant, blonde hair, bright face, and a polite smile that strained against her composure like a mask pulled too tight. Light glinted off the small name tag pinned to her uniform, Hannah. "An issue," Evelyn repeated softly, her tone calm. "Yes," Hannah replied. "It appears there was a mix-up in the system. We'll need you to move to seat 18C. She spoke as if reciting a script, her voice even detached. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "I'm afraid you must be mistaken." She reached into her bag and pulled out the printed boarding pass she always carried when she flew. "Here. Seat 2A. Paid pre-selected and confirmed last week." Hannah glanced at the ticket, her smile still fixed. "Yes, I understand. But there was a last-minute upgrade for another passenger, and they need this seat." "Need it? And what am I, then?" Evelyn asked, her voice, still quiet but edged with steel. The air in the cabin thickened. A few passengers stole glances in her direction, then quickly looked away, as if this moment did not concern them. The woman in the denim jacket, Rachel, lowered her magazine, her eyes locked on row 2A. Outside, sunlight streamed through the window, casting a glow across Evelyn's face. She sat upright, her hands resting on the armrest, not in defense, but to steady her heart. "I'm not trying to make things difficult, ma'am," Hannah said, lowering her voice. "If you could just cooperate, we can offer you a voucher as compensation." "I don't need a discount," Evelyn replied. "I need respect." Hannah blinked. She wasn't used to this kind of response. Not loud, not rude, but with a weight that stripped her words of all meaning. From behind came a man's voice. "Excuse me, this is seat 2. A correct A, tall man appeared. Salt and pepper hair, crisp, white shirt, leather laptop case in hand. He looked like the perfect image of corporate confidence, the kind of man used to being ushered forward, welcomed, accommodated." Hannah turned to him instantly, her smile transforming into something softer, more genuine. "Yes, sir. This is your seat." He nodded, waiting, not looking at Evelyn. He didn't have to, because in his mind, the seat already belonged to him. Evelyn remained seated. "I've been sitting here since boarding," she said slowly. "There's no mistake, just a misplaced sense of priority." Her voice was not loud, but it carried like a stream of cold water touching hot metal. No one in the cabin spoke. Only the hum of the engine and the sound of tightened breaths filled the silence. Rachel gripped the edges of her magazine. She saw it all the way the attendant avoided Evelyn's eyes, the quick, nervous glances from those around them. She recognized this scene, this so-called mix-up that people had used for generations to disguise their prejudice. Hannah forced one last smile. "Mrs. Carter, please understand, we need to resolve this quickly so we can depart." "You want speed," Evelyn said quietly. "But I want fairness." Her tone carried no anger, only a calm conviction that made Hannah falter. Across the aisle, a young white man bent over pretending to tie his shoelace. Another flight attendant, older with brown hair, watched from a distance and sighed. She clearly understood what was happening, but chose silence. The VIP man checked his watch impatiently. "Can we please move this along? I have a meeting at 11. Evelyn turned to him, her smile faint, but her eyes unwavering. "Perhaps you should have arrived earlier." "I did." The air froze. Hannah inhaled deeply. "Ma'am, if you refuse to move, I'll have to notify the captain." That sentence, short, cold, mechanical, was the thin line between service and authority. Evelyn understood. She had heard sentences like that all her life, in classrooms, in banks, at post offices, sentences light as air, yet heavy enough to push her to the margins. She took a breath and unbuckled her seatbelt. The soft click echoed through Hannah's chest like thunder. Evelyn stood lifting her worn leather bag, her gaze steady. "If my sitting in the correct seat makes others this uncomfortable, then I'll stand up. But don't call it cooperation." The cabin fell silent as she walked down the aisle. Faces turned downward. Rachel bit her lip, her eyes following her. An old man bowed his head. A young woman flushed red. Evelyn walked slowly, her back straight, her steps, steady each one, pressing firmly into the floor, not out of anger, but out of dignity. She reached row 18C and sat down. The space was cramped close to the lavatory. The engines rumble louder here. Evelyn placed her bag down and folded her hands. She did not cry, but when she looked at her own hands, thin, veined, trembling slightly, she knew it wasn't fear. It was disappointment. Rachel closed her eyes, gripping her phone tightly. The image of the silver-haired woman being asked to leave the front seat for a mix-up played over and over in her mind. Inside her, something stirred, a small flame, not yet blazing but refusing to die. Up front, the man now in seat 2A opened his laptop, typed a few lines, and sipped his coffee, as if nothing had happened. But Rachel's eyes narrowed. In her mind, Evelyn's calm, steady voice echoed, "I don't need a discount. I need respect." And Rachel knew the silence would not last. Not on this flight. Not today. In seat 18C, Evelyn leaned her head against the window. The plane drifted through layers of cloud sunlight, glinting off the glass, making her eyes shimmer. She didn't know that in seat 2, a man was sipping his coffee. In seat 6, a young woman was unlocking her phone, and in seat 12, a teenager had just opened his camera. The storm was coming, but it wasn't from the sky. It was rising from within the human heart. There were no arguments, no shouting, only the sound of rolling suitcases, the sharp tap of high heels against the cabin floor, and the faint click of a seatbelt, closing like the final word of a verdict. Evelyn Carter sat quietly in row 18C. The first-class cabin was only a few steps away, yet now it felt like another world, one she was no longer allowed to belong to. She placed her bag at her feet, folded her hands together. Through the small window, the sky stretched like a silk sheet, clouds floating softly in the distance. She tried to breathe deeply to steady herself, but every inhale ached. Not from the air, but from that familiar, cold, suffocating feeling of being treated as if she was worth less. She had taught thousands of children to never let anyone make them feel small. And yet here she was, sitting smaller than she had in years, surrounded by the quiet avoidance of strangers. An older woman in row 17 glanced her way, then quickly looked down, pretending to read the safety card. A young man wearing headphones stared at his phone, scrolling aimlessly. No one said anything. No one did anything. And it was that silence, not the flight attendant's actions, that hurt most. Up front, the VIP man had settled comfortably into seat 2, a laptop open fingers tapping briskly against the keyboard. Light from the window cast a cool glow across his cheek. Hannah, the young blonde flight attendant, leaned forward and poured coffee. "Hot coffee for you, sir." "Thank you," he replied without looking up. Everything moved like a well-oiled machine, efficient, polished, and utterly devoid of empathy. Only one person couldn't sit still, Rachel. The woman in the denim jacket in row 3 leaned forward, peering through the narrow aisle. She could see Evelyn sitting upright, shoulders trembling faintly, hands pressed against her knees. There was no rage, no complaint. Only silence, dignified, heart-breaking silence. Rachel bit her lip. Part of her wanted to stand up and shout, "You can't treat her like that." But another part hesitated. What right do I have? Would they throw me off the plane? She thought of her mother, who years ago had been accused of stealing at a store simply because she wore an old jacket. Her mother had stayed silent, just like Evelyn, and that silence had killed a piece of the 10-year-old girl who watched it happen. Rachel took a deep breath. Not this time. She wouldn't stay silent. In row 18, Evelyn closed her eyes. The steady hum of the engine filled her ears, but her mind was chaos. A voice inside whispered, "I should have fought back. I should have stayed. I should have." But another voice, gentler, weary, replied, "No. You've lived long enough to know that not all resistance requires noise." She did not cry. Tears had become a luxury, long reserved for funerals, for troubled students, for lonely nights after class. Yet her eyes burned. Not from shame, but from sorrow for a world where even a valid ticket could not buy respect. Rachel slammed her magazine shut. The dry thud made a few passengers jump. She stood up. The sharp sound of her seat, snapping upright, sliced through the hum of the engines. "Excuse me," she said, her voice clear, steady. "What just happened here isn't right." Every head turned. Hannah hurried forward, her voice calm but nervous. "Ma'am, please take your seat. We're preparing for takeoff." "No, I'm not sitting down," Rachel said firmly, pointing toward row 18. "That woman, I saw her in seat 2A from the beginning. She had her ticket. You forced her to move so someone else could sit there." Why, no one answered. The silence this time was no longer harmless. It had shape. It had guilt. The man in 2A froze, looked up and frowned. Hannah bit her lip. "Ma'am, I'm just following the system. We had another passenger who needed that seat. And—" "Needed," Rachel interrupted. "I need one too, so does she. But only one person got priority. And we all know why." The air tightened. A faint tisk came from somewhere, then vanished into quiet. Every gaze turned toward the front. The entire cabin held its breath. Evelyn opened her eyes. She saw Rachel standing there, light streaming through the window, her face calm but her eyes blazing. Evelyn wanted to whisper, "Don't," but her throat closed. A part of her trembled with fear, afraid the girl might be dragged out. But another part of her felt warm. It had been so long since she'd seen anyone stand up for someone like her. Hannah looked around, seeking support, but found only the cold, watching eyes of passengers. Another flight attendant, older with brown hair, stepped forward and gently placed a hand on Hannah's shoulder. "I'll handle this," she said softly. She turned to Rachel, her tone low, controlled. "Ma'am, we can discuss this after takeoff. Please take your seat." Rachel narrowed her eyes. "No. If I sit down, I'm complicit. And I won't be complicit." The murmurs began. A man in row 5 spoke quietly. "She's right." A woman in row 7 nodded. I saw her sitting there first, too. The whispers grew, rising like a tide. Each word cut through the sterile armor of procedure that Hannah was clinging to. In row 18, Evelyn felt her heart pounding. The scene before her blurred in the warm shimmer of tears. She hadn't wanted to cry, but this time her tears weren't from humiliation. They were from belief. Because someone in this world still saw her. The woman in denim stood there alone, but radiant, like the first crack in a wall of silence. The plane had not yet taken off. But in that narrow cabin, a tremor had begun. Not from the engines, but from the human heart. Evelyn leaned her head back against the seat, her gaze fixed on the front. And in her eyes, for the first time in many years, there was light again, the belief that sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to stand up to make the whole sky move. No one thought a single voice from an ordinary passenger could shake an entire airplane cabin. But when Rachel Miller stood up, it wasn't just sound. It was a blow to the wall of silence that had stood for far too long. "I'm not sitting down." Her voice was steady, not loud, but it cut straight through the space between the rows of seats. She didn't shout, she didn't tremble, she was simply certain. Every eye turned toward the front. The blonde flight attendant, Hannah, froze for a moment, then regained her professional smile. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset, but please cooperate. We're trying to make sure this flight departs on time." "On time?" Rachel raised an eyebrow, her tone sharp as a blade. "What about the right thing? Are you really planning to take off while an elderly woman gets kicked out of a seat she paid for, so a younger white man can sit there instead?" The sound inside the cabin vanished. 1 second of absolute silence, then a wave of murmurs began to spread. A young man whispered to his girlfriend. A middle-aged woman squeezed her daughter's hand tighter. The discomfort in the air wasn't from the tension, it was from the truth. Hannah swallowed hard. "Please don't misunderstand, Mum. It was just a system error," Rachel cut in. "No system makes the same mistake in the same direction every time, Hannah." Hearing her own name made Hannah flinch. For the first time, she realized she was no longer hidden behind her uniform. Her throat felt dry, her hands trembled, no matter how tightly she clasped them. From seat 2, the salt and pepper-haired VIP man lowered his laptop, his voice deep but impatient. "Excuse me, but I think you're overreacting. I'm just sitting where I was told." Rachel turned sharply toward him, her eyes flashing. "And when you saw a woman forced out of her seat, you didn't think that was wrong. It's not my business." "Exactly. That's the problem." The last 3 words hit the floor like nails. A beat of silence. Then a man in row 4 spoke. "She's right. I saw it too. The woman boarded before him. Everything began to shift." A young woman in row 6 raised her hand. "Same here." I saw her show her boarding pass to the staff. A teenager in row 10 lifted his phone and started recording. "Got it. Now the whole world will see." The cold blue light from the camera illuminated the cabin, turning it into an unplanned stage. Hannah's face drained of color. She tried to speak, but her voice no longer flowed. "Please, let's just stay calm." Rachel looked around, her voice low but heavy with meaning. Calm, calm for who? For the man in the wrong seat, or for the woman who was told she didn't belong in it? Her words weren't aimed only at Hannah. They pierced the invisible wall dividing the rows. A child looked up at her mother and whispered, "Mom, did they do something wrong?" The mother bit her lip and nodded slightly. A soft chime sounded, signaling the cabin door was still open. A chance either for justice or for silence was still there. In row 18, C. Evelyn sat up straight. Her hands gripped the armrest, her heart pounding. All her life she had taught her students to stand up for what's right. Yet here she was, sitting still. Rachel's voice echoed in her mind. No system makes the same mistake in the same direction. Evelyn understood it wasn't just about her anymore. She drew in a breath. But before she could speak, another voice rang out, a man's voice, rough, strong, filled with anger. I don't agree either. A man in his 40s wearing a sports jacket stood up from row 3. The cap on his head bore the logo of the Detroit Tigers. I was right here. I saw the whole thing. That woman was sitting first. Her boarding pass was clear, and they kicked her out to make room for someone else. That's disgraceful. A few claps sounded from the back, then more spreading like waves. Another passenger shouted, "Give her seat back." "Yeah, let her have her seat." The cabin erupted, like a dam finally bursting after too much pressure. Voices rose at once. The clicks of cameras, the sounds of recording started echoed from multiple phones. Hannah looked around, panicked. She grabbed the intercom and called the lead attendant. Her voice trembled. "We have a situation in first class." Evelyn remained seated, but her hands no longer shook. She looked toward the front, where Rachel stood in the aisle, her eyes blazing like fire. Evelyn's chest swelled with emotion, a deep mix of gratitude and worry. She didn't want anyone to get in trouble because of her. But when a voice from the crowd called out, "Mom, do you want your seat back?" she knew she had to answer. The entire cabin fell silent, waiting. Evelyn drew in a breath, her voice hoarse but clear. "I don't want to delay everyone's flight." Rachel turned toward her, her tone trembling but strong. "No, Mom, you're not delaying the flight. You're putting it back on course." Applause filled the air, not scattered this time, but unified, powerful. The man in 2A sighed, closing his laptop. "Fine," he muttered. "I don't want to be on camera anyway." He stood, lowered his head, and slipped out into the aisle, moving down toward another row. No one clapped for him, but everyone looked at Evelyn. Hannah held her breath. The lead flight attendant, the older woman with brown hair, stepped forward, her voice firm but calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be restoring Passenger Carter's original seat." A wave of relieved cheers rose through the cabin. Evelyn stood and walked slowly toward the front. No one avoided her eyes now. A few passengers reached out, touching her shoulder as she passed, whispering, "You did the right thing. We're with you." She reached seat 2A again. The same seat, yet it felt entirely different, no longer cold, but warm, grounded, reclaimed. As Evelyn sat down, Rachel smiled. Their eyes met, a silent exchange that carried the weight of everything that had just happened. Evelyn didn't say thank you because she didn't need to. Rachel didn't apologize because she didn't have to. Between them was an unspoken truth. Dignity doesn't need to be given. It just needs someone brave enough to keep it. When the plane finally took off, no one spoke. But somewhere, a red-haired teenager uploaded a 20-second video online. The caption was simple. They tried to move an old black woman out of her seat. The whole plane said no. Evelyn didn't know. Rachel didn't know. But soon, millions would know that on Blue Sky Flight 317, an entire cabin had just relearned the meaning of one simple word: justice. The wheels of the plane had not yet lifted off the runway, but inside the narrow cabin of Blue Sky Flight 317, a silent earthquake had already begun. It wasn't the vibration of the engines, but the awakening of dozens of hearts all at once. When Evelyn Carter returned to her seat, 2A, every sound seemed to dissolve into the stillness. The young flight attendant, Hannah, remained frozen at the end of the aisle, her face pale. The lead attendant, a woman with brown hair, lowered her head and spoke quietly into the intercom. "First class is now settled. Please fasten your seatbelts." But no one moved. Everyone kept their eyes on Evelyn, the 68-year-old black woman with neatly pinned silver hair, sitting tall in the sunlight streaming through the window, her hands resting gently on her knees. There was no more applause, none was needed, because in that moment everyone understood that silence had spoken louder than anything else. In row 3, Rachel was still standing. The fire in her eyes had softened, turning into something calmer, brighter pride. She looked at Evelyn and realized she had just witnessed something that would echo long after the plane landed. The man in the Detroit Tigers cap exhaled, nodded toward Evelyn and said quietly, "You did the right thing, Mom." She turned, offering a faint but warm smile. The air inside the cabin had changed. The once avoidant glances were now direct, sincere. A young mother leaned toward her daughter, whispering softly, "You see, fairness isn't a gift. It's something you stand up to reclaim." The little girl nodded, her eyes wide, as if she were memorizing the most important lesson of her life. But in the cockpit, the doors closed. Light had yet to turn on. The lead attendant received an instruction over the radio. "We're 15 minutes late. Keep the passengers calm. Don't let this escalate." Hannah swallowed hard. Her heart pounded her chest tight. She looked at Evelyn, the woman she had thought just minutes ago was a problem. Now she felt something else: shame, smallness, and fear. Fear not of Evelyn, but of herself for how easily she had chosen silence. Then from the back of the cabin, a voice spoke quiet, but enough to shift the air. I came back. Everyone turned. It was the VIP passenger, the man who had taken Evelyn's seat. He stood in the aisle, laptop in hand, his voice tired. "I don't need that seat anymore. I was just following instructions. But if this is holding everyone up, then fine, I'll sit somewhere else." His tone sounded humble, but no one applauded. Not because they were ungrateful, but because everyone knew some things can't be excused by convenience. Rachel looked at him and said quietly, her words clear and cutting, "Doing the right thing doesn't need directions." The man lowered his head and walked toward the back, avoiding every pair of eyes. His seat, 2A, now belonged to its rightful owner. This time, not because of an upgrade, but because of something greater: dignity. As the plane prepared for takeoff, an unfamiliar sound filled the air, the click of dozens of phones recording. The red-haired teenager in row 12 had gone live. "Everyone, this is Blue Sky Flight 317. They kicked an elderly woman out of her seat in first class, and the whole cabin stood up for her. We just witnessed justice happen." Within minutes, the footage streamed across thousands of screens. A short caption appeared. They moved an old black woman out of her seat, and the plane said, "No." Seconds later came hundreds of shares, comments, reactions. But inside the plane, no one knew. They only felt it, that even before takeoff, this flight had already traveled farther than most. Evelyn leaned back into her seat, her hand resting over her heart. It was beating fast but steady, not from fear but from something deeper peace. She hadn't won anything. She had simply reclaimed what should never have been taken. She turned her head slightly to the right, where Rachel sat a few rows away. 2 women, 2 generations, 2 races, 2 eras, sharing one wordless look. An invisible thread connected them. Courage isn't inherited through blood, it's passed on through example. As the plane left the ground, morning light poured through the window, illuminating seat 2A. Evelyn gazed outside. The sky spread wide and deep and still. A sense of freedom washed through her. In her mind, she heard Naomi's voice, her granddaughter's voice, saying, "Grandma, I'm going to build a cleaner, fairer world." Evelyn smiled. Maybe she thought that world begins right here. In row 6, a middle-aged white man bent down, opened his notebook and wrote quickly. It wasn't shouting. It wasn't anger. It was the silence of a woman who refused to move. And all of us, we moved inside ourselves. He closed the notebook, looked up and watched Evelyn. Another young flight attendant leaned close to Hannah, whispering, "They filmed everything. This is going online." Hannah closed her eyes. She knew this wouldn't end here. But somewhere deep inside, something in her felt lighter, because at least today she had learned that no protocol is greater than human dignity. Evelyn placed her hand against the window. She watched the sky drift past sunlight, reflecting across her wrinkled hand, the same hand that once held chalk and wrote on a blackboard, "Respect is not earned. It's deserved." She chuckled softly. That sentence today, she was living it. The intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We are now ready for takeoff." The plane trembled, then surged upward. At 10,000 meters above the ground below were layers of white clouds, and within the cabin a rare stillness, not of tension, but of reverence. The man in the tiger's cap turned to Rachel and said, "You know, I think we just witnessed a history lesson in the sky." Rachel smiled, her eyes still fixed ahead. "Not a lesson, sir. An awakening." Evelyn closed her eyes. She didn't know that by the time the plane landed, the video would have millions of views, tens of thousands of comments, and a wave of public outrage demanding an official apology from Blue Sky Airlines. She only knew that in this moment, high above the clouds for the first time in many years, she was sitting exactly where she belonged. Not because seat 2A was luxurious, but because for the first time, the small world around her had finally learned how to see a person. The plane had taken off, yet, inside the cabin, no one felt like they were flying. They were drifting in silence, in reflection, in the quiet aftershock of having witnessed something far greater than a simple flight. Evelyn Carter sat in seat 2A, her seat. The same leather cushion, the same soft light, the same scent of coffee hung in the air. But everything was different now. The space around her felt wider, not because of physical distance, but because the atmosphere itself had shifted ever since the moment the entire cabin chose to stand for what was right. Evelyn leaned back, her eyes half closed, not from fatigue, but from the steady rhythm of her heart, still echoing with what had just unfolded. A rapid, yet steady beat, warm alive. She hadn't cried when she was forced out of her seat, nor when she was given it back. But now in the calm after, it all tears came softly quiet, gentle warm. Not tears of pain, but of relief. All her life she had taught others, use your wisdom to speak, not your anger. But today, watching a young woman stand up for her, Evelyn realized that sometimes silence itself can be loud enough as long as it's held with dignity. In row 3, Rachel Miller tilted her head, slightly looking forward. Evelyn sat tall hands, resting on her lap like a queen on her reclaimed throne. The sight made Rachel smile, not in triumph, but in deep respect. She whispered, "You made them look again." The man in the Detroit Tigers cap, still seated a few rows away, turned to his travel companion and said quietly, "I can't remember the last time something moved me like this. Maybe this is why we still believe in people." Other passengers looked toward Evelyn too, not as someone who had just gotten her seat back, but as a small symbol of something much larger. For a brief moment, the entire cabin felt united. There were no more labels, no more first class or economy. There were only people, and the justice they had just reclaimed together. On the small screen in front of her, the flight map showed a thin line stretching between 2 cities, Atlanta and Boston. But to Evelyn, it felt like a line connecting 2 worlds, one of silent endurance, and one where someone finally dared to say enough. She took a tissue, dabbed her eyes gently, and opened her phone. There was no signal, but she stared at the photo of Naomi, her granddaughter in her graduation gown, smiling brightly. Evelyn whispered, "You see, sweetheart, I kept my seat just like I told you, to keep yours." In the cockpit, the captain and the lead flight attendant exchanged a few words. "We're stable now. Yes, everything's fine. The flight is back on course." But that video... They didn't know that, as they spoke, social media was already catching fire. A 23-second clip, shaky but clear enough to see an elderly black woman being asked to leave her seat, and a cabin full of people rising in protest. Thousands of comments began to flood in beneath it. This made me cry. She handled it with grace. "Tag the airline. They need to see this." Within hours, the video would pass 1 million views. But inside Flight 317, no one knew. They were still living in the quiet version of a storm that was already breaking outside. Hannah, the young flight attendant, stood at the back, her mind spinning. Only minutes ago, she had been proud of how strictly she'd followed procedure. Now every phrase of "we apologize for the inconvenience" echoed in her head like a crack across glass. She had done her job correctly, but had she done what was right? Slowly, she stepped forward, stopping beside seat 2. Her voice trembled. "Mrs. Carter, I want to apologize." Evelyn opened her eyes and looked up at the young woman. Her gaze was soft, not angry, not condescending. "What did you learn today?" she asked gently. Hannah swallowed hard. "That silence isn't always neutral." Evelyn smiled. "Then you've learned the most important lesson." Hannah bowed her head, eyes glistening. Her hands, once rigid and rehearsed, now trembled not from fear, but from shame. She didn't know it yet, but weeks later she would apply for a position at a non-profit dedicated to fairness and equity in customer service training. And this very moment, this quiet apology, would be where that journey began. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the captain's voice came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached 30,000 feet. The skies are clear and our flight will be smooth." Evelyn turned to the window. The sky was so clear she could see the horizon curve. Up here, all differences vanished. Wealth, power, status, all reduced to specks of dust, floating in the same invisible air. She murmured softly to herself, "Up here everyone's equal. If only the ground could be the same." Rachel leaned forward slightly, looking toward the front. She wanted to say thank you, but she didn't. She knew Evelyn didn't need to hear it. The calm presence of that woman was its own answer, louder than any words. She turned to the man in the tiger's cap and said quietly, she didn't need to win. She just needed to be seen. He nodded. And now the whole world will see her. Evelyn placed her hand on the cup of water on her tray, her fingers brushing the cool surface. She took a small sip, then glanced around. A few passengers met her eyes and nodded. No words. No noise. But the respect in their gaze was enough to warm the entire cabin. She leaned back against her seat. The silence returned, but it wasn't the silence of fear or submission that had filled the plane at the start of the flight. This was a different silence, peaceful, complete. The aircraft soared into the sunlight, slicing through layers of clouds. An old woman closed her eyes and smiled. A young woman watched her, her heart filled with renewed faith. A cabin full of strangers suddenly realized they were all on the same side. No one said victory. No one shouted justice. There was only one quiet truth. When one woman refuses to be moved from her rightful place, the world itself must move to make room for respect. When Blue Sky Flight 317 landed in Boston, the sun was already high. Golden light poured through the windows like honey. Passengers gathered their belongings. Seatbelts clicked open. Wheels bumped softly against the carpet. Everything seemed ordinary, except for one thing. No one left that flight as the same person who had boarded. Evelyn Carter stood, straightened her cardigan, and took her bag from the overhead bin. No one tried to squeeze past her. A man in row 4 stepped back with a small smile and said, "You go ahead, ma'am." A young woman helped her reach for the suitcase and whispered, "We saw everything. You did the right thing." Evelyn only nodded, her lips barely moving. "Thank you, dear." No one on the jet bridge knew that, at that very moment, millions outside already knew her name. Somewhere else, a 23-second clip had exploded. At 6:47 in the morning, Eastern Time on TikTok, the account at Fly Guy Jake posted a video. They moved an old black woman out of her first-class seat for some random dude. The whole plane said no. The footage was shaky and grainy, with only snatches of Rachel's voice and the sound of a man closing his laptop. Its rawness, unedited and unpolished, made it spread like fire riding the wind. The first comment read, "This broke my heart." She didn't even raise her voice. Then came thousands more tag the airline. "She deserves a public apology. I can't believe this is still happening in 2025. Within 2 hours, the video reached 2.3 million views and 600,000 shares, and it was stitched, commented on and analyzed by hundreds of large accounts. The hashtag number sign, Seat 2A, began to appear. Then number sign, Respect First. Then number sign, Evelyn Carter. By midday, America was saying that name, the silver-haired woman who made a cabin full of people wake up. When the plane reached the gate, Evelyn's phone lit up again and again. Messages poured in like a summer downpour. From her son, Marcus' mom, "Everyone's talking about you online. Are you okay?" From a former colleague, Miss Davis, at Jefferson Elementary. "Evelyn, I saw the clip. I cried. I'm so proud of you." She read them without fully understanding. She had never gone viral in her life. She only knew she had defended her seat not to be famous, but to hold on to something deeper dignity. She silenced the alerts and walked off the plane. No one there knew who she was. But as she passed Gate 14, a security officer recognized the face from his phone and bowed his head slightly. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter." "Thank you." She paused. "You recognize me? I think everyone is beginning to recognize you." Meanwhile, at Blue Sky Airlines headquarters in Chicago, the communications floor was chaos. Screens showed the video flooding every platform. The communications manager shouted, "Shut down all ads. Do not let #blue sky racist climb the charts." Another staffer blurted, "They are calling for a boycott Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, everywhere." The public relations director slammed a hand on the table. "Put out a statement. Immediately say it was a technical error and that we apologize for the inconvenience." A young staffer's voice shook. "But inconvenience sounds hollow. There is no time for feelings. Write it." Hours later, the airline's Twitter feed posted, "We are aware of a seating mix-up on Blue Sky Flight 317. Blue Sky is committed to fair and respectful service for all passengers. We apologize for any inconvenience caused." The last line, "any inconvenience," broke the dam. Replies poured in. Inconvenience, she was humiliated in front of the entire cabin. This isn't a system glitch, this is bias. A real apology calls the problem by its name. Every tweet landed like a blow to the company's reputation. Within 24 hours, Blue Sky's stock dipped about 3%. But worse than that, customer trust went into freefall. Evelyn did not read any of it. She sat in a taxi on the way to her hotel, watching the yellowing trees slide past. Her head was tired, but her heart was calm. She wanted a warm shower, a light dinner, and tomorrow morning, the sight of Naomi at her graduation. Her phone buzzed without stopping, hundreds of unread notifications, but she let them go. She did not want noise. She wanted peace, the same peace that had somehow shaken the world. On a large screen in a coffee shop near the concourse, CNN rolled a headline, "The social media storm called Seat 2A." An elderly passenger asked to leave her first-class seat for reasons not yet confirmed. Witnesses call it discrimination. Blue Sky Airlines faces pressure to issue a public apology. People around the cafe watched closely. A man murmured, "I thought things like that only happened in movies." A young woman added, "No, it happens every day today. Someone just filmed it." The shop fell quiet for a few seconds as the final frame of the clip filled the screen. Evelyn Carter seated in 2A, looking out the window, morning light helloing her silver hair. The subtitle read, "She didn't shout. She didn't fight. She just stayed seated." A hush spread through the room, the hush of respect. That night, Evelyn lay in her hotel room. The window was cracked open, Boston's breeze stirring the curtain. On the table, her phone still glowed with notifications, calls, messages. One of them was an email from the Morning Circle show. "We would love to invite Mrs. Carter to join our program tomorrow morning. You are inspiring millions." Evelyn did not reply. She exhaled softly, closed the phone, and whispered, "I did not set out to inspire. I just wanted to sit in my seat." She turned off the light. Outside, the city still blazed with neon and headlines. Across America, people were saying her name. And from the quiet of that small room, an ordinary woman had become a symbol of dignity, simply because she refused to get up. The next morning, the Boston sky was clear and bright, but Evelyn Carter still hadn't slept. All night her phone had been ringing without pause, messages, emails, calls from reporters, from strangers, from voices she had never known, yet spoke her name as if they had known her forever. "Thank you for speaking up for so many of us. You don't know me, but I cried watching the clip. I once stayed silent like you did that day. I won't anymore." Evelyn read each line, her hands trembling slightly. She didn't understand why the world cared so much about what had happened to her. She thought I didn't do anything great. I just refused to be moved. Around noon, her son Marcus called. His voice was bright with excitement. "Mum, you're on national news. Every outlet, every talk show hashtag Seat 2A is trending #1 on Twitter. Everyone's talking about you." Evelyn sat down on the edge of the bed and smiled softly. "Son, I don't know what people are looking for in me, but if it makes them think a little differently, then that's a good thing." "Do you want to give an interview?" Marcus asked. "They want you to speak on television." "No," Evelyn said. "I don't need cameras. I have paper and a pen, and that's enough." Marcus was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said softly, "I understand." Evelyn pulled the small desk closer to the window. Noon light poured across the blank page. She took a deep breath, picked up her pen, and began to write. Just one page, but every word carried the weight of a lifetime. "I didn't plan to go viral. I only planned to attend my granddaughter's graduation. Yesterday I was asked to leave a seat that I had bought chosen and arrived early to claim. They called it a mistake. But what saddened me wasn't losing the seat. It was that old familiar feeling of being treated as invisible. I spent my life teaching my students that they deserve respect, no matter where they come from or what color their skin is. Yesterday, I had to remind myself of that same lesson. I don't hate anyone. I only hope that next time, when someone is treated unfairly, it won't take an entire airplane to recognize that it's wrong." She signed it simply, Evelyn M. Carter. Marcus posted the letter on social media with a short caption, "These are my mother's words, the woman who didn't need to shout to be heard." Within 4 hours, the post had over 400,000 shares, millions of interactions, and was quoted on every platform. That evening talk shows opened with one headline: "I didn't go viral. I just refused to move." People began calling Evelyn Carter the grandma of dignity. A teacher, a politician, a black artist each wrote, "We need more Evelyns in this world." In the quiet of her small room, Evelyn sat still, the letter she had written resting in her hand. Outside, the autumn wind drifted past the window, swirling golden leaves against the glass. She knew then that her story was no longer just about one flight. It was the story of everyone who had ever been told to give up their seat for someone deemed more important. And now she no longer had to teach anyone. The world was teaching itself again, that lesson from a woman who simply stayed where she belonged. Saturday morning dawned crystal clear over Boston. On the campus of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, thousands of graduates in black robes prepared to cross the invisible line between learning and living. Among the sea of people, Evelyn Carter appeared in a simple navy blue dress, a wide-brimmed hat, and her old pearl earrings. She didn't walk quickly. She moved slowly, each step measured, each breath steady, as if every movement was a quiet affirmation that she belonged in this world, in this moment, exactly where she stood. A security officer approached her with a smile. "Are you Mrs. Evelyn Carter?" "Yes," she replied. "I'm here to see my granddaughter graduate." He nodded and gestured politely. "Please follow me. There's a special seat reserved just for you." Evelyn looked puzzled. At the front row, just behind the university leadership, was a single empty chair. On it sat a small sign, "Guest of Honor, Mrs. Evelyn Carter." She froze in silence. No one had ordered her to sit there. No one had given up their seat. That chair had been offered to her freely out of genuine respect. When the ceremonial music began, the procession of students marched by. Each name echoed through the crowd, followed by bursts of applause. And then the name she had waited a lifetime to hear rose into the air. Naomi Elise Carter. Evelyn stood up. Her eyes glistened, but her smile shone bright as the early summer sun. Naomi stepped onto the stage, her graduation gown fluttering in the breeze, her face glowing with pride. When she looked down and saw her grandmother, her lips trembled and then broke into tears. After the ceremony, they embraced beneath a red maple tree. Naomi's voice quivered. "I saw everything, Grandma. The video, your letter, everyone at school is talking about you." Evelyn smiled gently, brushing a strand of hair from her granddaughter's face. "I didn't mean to teach any more lessons," she said softly. "But maybe life decided to teach alongside me." "They're calling you a symbol," Naomi whispered. "The grandma of dignity." Evelyn shook her head. "I'm no symbol. I'm just someone who refused to give her seat to something wrong." That afternoon, when she returned to her hotel, an envelope waited for her at the front desk. The Blue Sky Airlines logo was embossed faintly on the paper. Inside was an elegant invitation signed by the company's chief executive officer. "We would be honored to invite Mrs. Evelyn Carter to serve as the keynote speaker at the Global Equality Conference to share her inspiring message of respect and inclusion." Evelyn read the letter slowly, line by line. Then she smiled, not bitterly, not with pride, just the quiet smile of someone who understood the value of silence. She dialed the number listed in the letter. "I'm very grateful for the invitation," she said, her voice calm as a breeze. The voice on the other end brightened immediately. "Of course, Mrs. Carter, we'd be deeply honored," Evelyn interrupted, gentle but firm. "But I won't be attending. May I ask why, Mrs. Carter?" She answered softly, "Because I wasn't invited to speak. I already did the moment I chose not to leave my seat." She hung up, stood by the window, and opened it. The wind carried the scent of fresh grass and the distant chime of church bells. Below the city pulsed with life cars, footsteps, countless stories, each person fighting their own small battle to be seen. Evelyn whispered quietly, as if bidding farewell to the woman she had been yesterday. "Sometimes the most powerful speech is the one delivered in silence." She closed the window. And as the golden light of evening poured over Boston, the image of the silver-haired woman slowly melted into the sunset, not needing a microphone, not needing a stage, because the whole world had already heard her message, born from one simple, peaceful act, staying in her seat. From the perspective of a scholar in leadership culture and social ethics, the journey of Evelyn Carter is not merely the story of a first-class seat, but a lesson about the place of human dignity in the modern world, where respect is not a privilege, but the foundation of character. She needed no stage, no grand speech. Simply by refusing to leave her seat, she made an entire system confront itself and compelled the world to listen to the silence that carried the weight of justice. In an era where noise often drowns out reason, Evelyn reminds us that true power sometimes lies in calmness and grace. If you believe the world needs more people who dare to stand or sit for what is right, then like this video to spread that message. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the stories where humanity is tested by prejudice, and leave a comment below with the phrase that reflects your belief in that value: hold your dignity.